Hi again, welcome back to the discussion of the specific fallacies, and this time we'll focus on violations of the closure rule, which is part of the 10 rules for critical discussion. So you might think it's rule number 10, but it's rule number 9, because there's still a language rule, a use rule coming up, and I think the reason for its being last is that it applies to all discussion stages, and the closure rule, of course, only applies to the concluding stage. But that's just my guess. Anyway, the closure rule lays down that after a failed defense of a standpoint, the protagonist may not maintain this standpoint, and after a successful defense of a standpoint, the antagonist may not maintain his or her doubts, which makes sense, and therefore also some violations of this rule are very clearly unreasonable, but there are sometimes also a little bit more subtle violations, and one of them you can see here. So here we have a discussant who argues that doing a warming up before a run actually doesn't help, and the reason for that, this person says, is nobody ever showed that it helps. Now, this argument is actually not really reasonable, because that nobody showed that it helps doesn't mean that it doesn't help. It just means that we don't know whether it helps. Maybe nobody tried to show that it helped, or maybe someone attempted to do it but not very seriously, and so we still don't know it. So if you reason in this way, you could be committing a fallacy, and I think this is one way or one example in which that happens. And this fallacy is called the ad ignorantium fallacy, or argumentum ad ignorantium. Now, I have a question for you. Can you think of a situation in which it's perfectly fine if you argue that your standpoint holds because the opposite standpoint is incorrect? So a situation similar to the warming up example, but then a situation in which we should agree that it's not a fallacy. So if you need more time, just pause the clip here. But I think you might come up with either of these two answers, because I think this is possible. You can actually argue in this way without being unreasonable. And one situation is a situation in which you have a binary topic. And that is if there's only two possible options, so it's an either or situation. And I have an example here. It's a little bit of a meta discussion here, but bear with me. So we have an example, a standpoint here, and the standpoint is an argument is either sound or fallacious. Oh, sorry, this isn't the standpoint, this is the argument. So we have an argument here, an argument is either sound or fallacious, and then another premise in this argument is not fallacious, so you should conclude that this argument is sound. And this actually works. This example works because the argument is sound, but also soundness and fallaciousness, those are binary. Soundness is a binary concept with either arguments being sound or fallacious. So this argumentation is perfectly fine. Another example that you could have come up with is the following kind of example. So scientific arguments in which everything is kept constant except for the thing that needs to be measured. So think about some kind of drug test, for instance. Based on critical rationalism, we actually can only know with certainty, that's the idea, when something is false and never when something is true. And so you cannot really prove that, for instance, a drug is effective according to this rationale. But if you keep the circumstances in which you test a drug so very constant, and you create a sort of binary situation that if you see, for instance, that there's no side effects, then you can conclude that this drug is safe. If you create a binary situation, then you can conclude, if you really don't find any side effects, you can actually conclude that this drug is safe. Or at least that we have some conventions like statistical significance to determine whether it's safe or not. So that would be another context in which I think you could sort of reason in this way, claiming that your standpoint holds because the opposite is incorrect, while not committing a fallacy. Now, back to the closure rule. We've seen that you can violate this rule by means of an ad ignorantiam fallacy, but there are other less subtle ways to violate this rule. For instance, if you refuse to retract a standpoint that has not been successfully defended. So you admit that you find the opposite arguments very convincing, but you still maintain your standpoint. Or if you conclude that your standpoint is true because it has been defended successfully. Now this sounds maybe odd that they call this a fallacy, but think about all these discussions back in the day about whether the Earth is the center of the universe, for instance. People probably defended this successfully, but still wasn't true. So you cannot equate truth with making claims acceptable. So there's a subtle distinction, but this is how you could maybe commit this fallacy. And there's a last option here, and that is an option that could go wrong because the antagonist refuses to retract criticism of a standpoint that has been successfully defended. So that's actually the opposite of our second option of a fallacy. So the second option could be committed by a protagonist. Well, these are maybe some kind of blunt violations of this rule. I tried to find an example. I found maybe a little bit of an obscure one, I'm not sure. It's a discussion from Twitter, and you see there are 3 discussion parties involved, and it is about a basketball game. Apparently Auburn played Virginia in 2019. I don't know too much about basketball, but that isn't necessary for this discussion, so it's probably okay. So this first person number blue, the blue person here, I just try to make them anonymous, and this is the blue one. The blue discussant says Auburn got cheated, what do y'all think? And then the red person says cheated is the wrong word, and then this player who's named Kid made a huge mistake, fouling the shooter, tough break, life's full of them, so it's not cheating. But then discussant blue says, what about the double dribble? Referees didn't see that though, and this green discussant immediately replies to the blue one, but I couldn't put them together on the slide because then you couldn't read it anymore, so it's next to the second reaction by blue. Anyway, so the first reaction by green, so up here, no one saw it, absolutely no one saw it, there was the double dribble, right, but one referee saw him bumping into the shooter, game was over. And then the assistant coaches for Auburn have even said that the double dribble was nearly impossible to call. The play was too bang-bang and Auburn was looking to foul. And then the reaction by blue, which I find interesting, is that blue says, okay, but I still believe they got cheated. And I'm not sure whether this is an instance of this second fallacy, because it's maybe a little bit more subtle, maybe blue doesn't fully admit that the opposite point is successfully proven, but she still says okay. So, but if you follow this, if you see okay as an agreement with the previous remarks that it was too subtle to foul and that cheated is the wrong word, then if she then concludes that they still got cheated, then you can say that it's a fallacy of refusing to retract a standpoint that has not been successfully defended. Okay, maybe less clarifying that I want it to be this example, but anyway, it's one example and hopefully it helps. So thank you for your attention, and there's one more rule to go, so also check out our rule number 10, clip. Okay.